I'm Dr. Jordan Bimm, a historian of space exploration and professor of science communication here in Chicago at the University of Chicago. As was mentioned, I wrote my PhD dissertation on the history of American space medicine called Anticipating the Astronaut. It'll be out in book form next year on the MIT Press. And even though I've lived and worked here in Chicago for 4 years, I'm originally from Toronto, Canada, proud Canadian. And in 2017, I served as the background researcher for this exhibit, which I'm so happy has finally made its way from Ottawa here to Chicago. This evening, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of space medicine. My goal is to provide you with a little bit of history and context to enhance your experience of the exhibit we're about to see. First, I'll give you a general overview of the history of space medicine and how it developed here in the United States. And then I will turn to the Canadian connection. And I'll tell you the surprising story of how Canada came to specialize in space medicine. So first, what is space medicine? Space medicine is the field devoted to the health and safety of astronauts. Space medicine covers everything from basic research into the limits and capabilities of the human body in space, to applying this research to the selection, training, and care of astronauts before, during, and after their missions. Now, to conjure a picture in your mind of space medicine, all you have to do is think about your favorite movie about space exploration. Maybe it's The Right Stuff, like I've got up here, or Apollo 13, or perhaps First Man. There's usually a scene near the beginning of the film, before they go to space, where astronaut hopefuls are being examined by doctors. You see them undergo exhaustive medical examinations, grueling stress tests, and disorienting simulations, all to determine if they are fit for the rigors of spaceflight. This is the world of space medicine. Now, most people think that space medicine got its start at NASA and is a product of the space race in the 1960s. The field is usually understood as a post-Sputnik science. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. This event ignited the Cold War's space race and created an urgent political crisis in the United States about the status of US science and technology. And this compelled the US Congress to quickly create NASA over the summer of 1958. When NASA began operations in October 1958, one of the agency's first goals was to put a human in space, an effort called Project Mercury. To do this, NASA needed astronauts, and just a few months later, in April 1959, NASA presented 7 military test pilots with degrees in engineering to the world as the Mercury 7, America's first astronaut group. For many people, it makes sense to assume that this public debut of the astronaut would also signal the origin of the field of space medicine. But this is not the case. In April 1959, space medicine research had already been happening for over a decade. Space medicine research began not at NASA in the late 1950s, but in the late 1940s within the US Air Force as a military project. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, scientists working for the US Air Force in the field of aviation medicine were interested in extending their work on pilots to the futuristic idea of the astronaut. They argued that their current work of keeping Cold War pilots alive high in the stratosphere was already functionally similar to spaceflight, requiring a totally sealed artificial environment. In 1949, the US Air Force established the world's first Department of Space Medicine to explore the medical challenges of spaceflight. The new Department of Space Medicine was located at the US Air Force's School of Aviation Medicine, which is a research and teaching facility located in San Antonio, Texas. Right from the start, Air Force scientists identified that spaceflight would present many hazards to the human body. These included intense G-forces of rocket launch and re-entry, breathing thin, low-pressure atmospheres that were artificial, temperature extremes, radiation exposure, and of course, the strange, disorienting state of zero-G, or weightlessness. They also foresaw psychological hazards, including isolation, confinement, and monotony. So 10 years before NASA debuted the Mercury 7, the Air Force's Department of Space Medicine was up and running. Now, the person that the Air Force chose to lead the Department of Space Medicine was a man who later became known in the US as the father of space medicine. And he was a German medical doctor and physiologist named Hubertus Strughold. We see him here. During World War II, Strughold served as director of the Luftwaffe's Aviation Medicine Research Institute in Berlin. And despite his knowledge of and connections to heinous, lethal human experiments on children and concentration camp prisoners, Strughold was recruited to the US as part of Operation Paperclip. Most of you probably know Operation Paperclip was a secretive program run by the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, to bring roughly 1,500 German experts from defeated Nazi Germany to work here in the United States. Now, when most people think of Operation Paperclip, their mind instantly goes to the famous rocket designer, Wernher von Braun, and his team of engineers who ended up in Huntsville, Alabama, working for the US Army and later for NASA. They created NASA's most famous rocket, the Saturn V, which propelled Apollo astronauts to the moon. But Operation Paperclip also included medical doctors, physiologists, and psychologists. And under Strughold, at the Air Force's Department of Space Medicine, these German experts went to work, not on the rocket, but on the astronaut, the human, who would ride inside of it. Strughold organized the very first space medicine symposium in 1950, and it actually took place right here in Chicago, at the University of Illinois at Chicago, just a little ways over across downtown. This picture here shows the early Department of Space Medicine, along with Wernher von Braun, who you can see third from the right there, out having dinner after the symposium at a local Chicago restaurant. If any of you are restaurant historians and can identify this restaurant for me, please do let me know. The symposium also resulted in the very first book about space medicine, titled Space Medicine, the Human Factor in Flights Beyond Earth, published in 1951 by the University of Illinois Press. I have a copy here in my bag if anyone would like to see it after the talks. Over the course of the 1950s, Strughold directed groundbreaking research into space medicine. They conducted the first ever simulation of a spaceflight where a young airman was sealed inside an airtight capsule for a week. They conducted the first expedition to an extreme Earth analog environment for the purpose of space medicine. This was a 6-week-long expedition to the summit of Mount Evans in Colorado as an altitude acclimatization attempt. They pioneered the process of flying parabolic arcs to experiment with brief moments of weightlessness. They accelerated humans on powerful rocket sleds and lofted them high into the stratosphere in balloon gondolas. They also carried out medical screenings and anthropometric studies of military pilots and other populations of interest. At the time, the US Air Force believed that space would become its domain in the coming years, did not anticipate the creation of a civilian agency like NASA. And their plan for astronauts was not scientists and explorers per se, but rather military men, conducting military missions in space, like reconnaissance or operating weapons systems. The motto that Strughold selected for his Department of Space Medicine was Astronautico sub venemus, which is Latin for "we support the astronaut." But Strughold and his German colleagues were doing much more than merely passively supporting. They were actively constructing the astronaut as an idea and as a concept through this medical work. Through their studies and simulations and expeditions, they were building up a particular vision of an ideal spacefaring body in mind, a particular vision of who could go to space and whose bodies were right or wrong for the space environment. Then, Sputnik launched, NASA was suddenly created in the summer of 1958, and the new agency lacked medical expertise. So it drew heavily on this decade of military space medicine for Project Mercury and the Mercury 7. Over the 1960s, NASA built its own space medicine capabilities on this military foundation, employing experts trained in the US Air Force. Hubertus Strughold himself never worked directly for NASA. He stayed in the Air Force until he retired in 1968, but the agency held him in very high regard. For example, in July 1969, NASA invited Strughold, as we see here, to be present in mission control in Houston, so the father of space medicine could personally be present for the historic flight of Apollo 11. In the 1960s, space medicine at NASA expanded from basic research to include clinical care for astronauts before, during, and after their space flights. Research progressed from ground-based labs and simulations and studies to also include studies conducted in space by astronauts themselves. This started with NASA's Skylab program in the 1970s and grew with the Space Shuttle in the 1980s. Today, on the ISS, space medicine is a primary focus. Astronauts study their own bodies, measuring how the zero-G weightless environment weakens bones, shrinks muscles, and alters blood circulation. They also test countermeasures like exercising on a treadmill to mitigate these effects. In 75 years, space medicine has evolved from theory to practice, from military to civilian contexts, and from ensuring survival on short flights measured in hours or days to supporting long-duration missions measured in months. Initially, space medicine's focus was on the bodies of military pilots, leading to a bias towards healthy white men as the norm for space. However, the types of people venturing into space have diversified. In the 1950s, space was a military domain, so the first astronauts were military pilots. But in the 1960s, space became increasingly about science and exploration, leading NASA to include scientists and medical doctors as astronauts. Of course, it wasn't until 1978 that NASA first selected women and visible minorities to join the astronaut corps. Recently, commercial spaceflight has introduced new types of space travelers, including wealthy tourists and their chosen companions, flying with companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Axiom. What space is for heavily influences who space is for. And new uses of space create new types of spacefarers and present new challenges for space medicine. A good example of this is NASA's Artemis program, which is working towards establishing a permanent presence on the moon. Future Artemis missions could have humans spending more time in space and further from Earth than ever before. Astronauts living and working on the moon, or one day even on Mars, will face new medical challenges, including increased radiation exposure and the hazard of breathing fine dust particles from the surface regolith. But what does any of this have to do with Canada? What explains this exhibit's focus on Canadian space medicine? Now, when we think of Canada's contributions to space, one of two things probably comes to mind. Either the Canadarm family of giant robotic arms used on NASA space shuttles and now on the ISS, or the musical stylings of Canada's most famous astronaut, Commander Chris Hadfield, who famously covered David Bowie's Space Odyssey while in orbit. But Canada is also a global leader in space medicine, a specialization that has a surprising origin story. It starts over 100 years ago, back in 1921, with a seemingly unrelated medical milestone. It was in 1921 at the University of Toronto, where medical researchers Frederick Banting and Charles Best discovered insulin. For their discovery of this life-saving treatment for diabetes, Banting was awarded the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology. Banting leveraged this success to establish his own research institute at the University of Toronto, initially focused on cancer research. However, in 1938, with the looming threat of war in Europe, his British colleagues persuaded Banting to pivot towards aviation medicine, vital for new high-altitude, high-speed fighter aircraft. Banting's institute tackled problems like the lack of oxygen, low temperatures, and something new that the pilots themselves were calling blackout. Blackouts were occurring when fighter pilots performed high-speed turns or pulled out of steep dives. They would lose consciousness, black out, and crash and kill themselves. This was due to G-force, centrifugal forces that pull blood away from the head towards the lower half of the body. Banting gave the task of solving blackout to another cancer researcher named Wilbur Franks, who we see here. Together, Banting and Franks constructed a new top-secret human centrifuge to reproduce this effect by spinning human subjects into unconsciousness. At the time, it was the only operational human centrifuge in North America. This led Wilbur Franks to develop the first anti-G suit, a special garment now worn by fighter pilots and astronauts that squeezes the lower part of the body to maintain blood flow to the brain and therefore consciousness. Sadly, Banting didn't live to see his suit in action. He died in December 1941 when his plane crashed in Newfoundland on his way to England to test a prototype of the flying suit. The Franks flying suit, as it came to be known, saw action starting in 1942 and is considered one of the early forerunners of the modern spacesuit. Banting's death did not halt momentum. Canada continued to advance in aviation medicine during World War II and into the Cold War, eventually combining this research with Arctic and underwater research under the umbrella of environmental medicine. Here we can see a modern-day human centrifuge located in Toronto at DRDC, Defense Research and Development Canada's laboratory there. With the space age, Canada recognized the prohibitive costs of an independent space program. So instead, leaders decided to specialize in robotics, like the Canadarm, and space medicine, given their running start in aviation medicine, and to trade this expertise with NASA for access to space. This strategic partnership is exemplified by the Canadian Space Agency's close collaboration with NASA on the Space Shuttle program, the International Space Station, and of course the Artemis program. Canada's first astronaut, Marc Garneau, who you see here on the far right, flew on the Space Shuttle in 1985, bringing with him Canadian space medicine experiments focused on space adaptation syndrome. Space adaptation syndrome is a form of something like motion sickness or disorientation that many astronauts have to contend with while adjusting to arriving in a weightless environment. Dr. Roberta Bondar, who you can see here, my hero growing up, followed in 1992 as the first Canadian woman in space and the first neuroscientist from any nation to fly in space. And she conducted further research on the syndrome. Since 1985, 9 Canadian astronauts have flown on 17 NASA missions, with nearly half of our astronauts being medical doctors or medical researchers. This emphasis on selecting and flying medically inclined astronauts reflects Canada's historic emphasis on aviation medicine and space medicine. This tradition, stemming from Banting's discovery of insulin all the way back in 1921, underscores Canada's significant yet often overlooked contributions to space medicine. Now, this exhibit was initially designed in 2018 to coincide with David Saint-Jacques, the most recent Canadian astronaut's flight to the International Space Station. David served on the ISS for 6 months from December of 2018 to June 2019. As a medical doctor specializing in emergency and remote care, his mission highlighted Canada's expertise in space medicine. The Canadian Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa commissioned and developed this exhibit to showcase and raise awareness of Canada's long-standing global leadership in space medicine. And finally, now is the perfect time for international audiences to learn about Canada's space program. Next year, NASA's historic Artemis II mission will carry a crew of 4 astronauts around the moon, including a Canadian astronaut, Jeremy Hansen. On Artemis II, Jeremy Hansen will earn the distinction of being the first non-American to depart Earth orbit into deep space. So when Artemis II launches towards the moon, and there's a spotlight on Jeremy and the Canadian Space Agency, you can think back and remember this exhibit about Canada's proud tradition of space science and exploration in partnership with NASA. Thank you very much for your attention.